and light across the farthest sea. May God be with our boys tonight, wherever they may be.
He had spent a year in teaching English, I think it was at the University of Lyon in France. After his Harvard, he graduated from Harvard and also received a master's degree. And then he taught in France for a year. But then, very shortly after, spent a year with the American Field Service, the ambulance service, in the trenches, transporting the injured from the trenches back to the hospitals that were behind the lines. That was a horrific experience for him, as was that whole aspect of the war. And he was deeply affected by that.
He wrote 2 books about his World War I experiences. And he has a book called A Volunteer Poilu that's about being an ambulance driver at the Battle of Verdun. Mm-hmm. And the descriptions that he has in there are incredibly detailed, but they're horrifying things that he was seeing. He saw some awful stuff. I mean, wholesale slaughter, and just that indifference to human pain and suffering.
In walking through the wood, a cut, but with a little more than the trunk standing, we saw an object in the tree. We investigated and found, pinned in a branch, a human heart. Someone had been blown to bits, and by a strange chance the heart had found lodgment in the tree.
He had been talking to a French soldier, and the soldier was very, very anxious to hear what the people back in the United States thought. You know, do they think we'll win the war? Do you think the United States will enter the war? So he and Henry, who could, of course, speak fluent French, talked at some length about the American attitudes in the war. Just then they hear a shell coming in. They dive for cover. When it passes, it explodes nearby. When Henry gets up, he looks back, and there he sees this soldier with the left side of his chest torn open and the blood dripping down his arm, the heart exposed. That was the first death that he saw close up during the war.
On the loneliest of nights, beneath the blackened skies of France, with exploding torpedoes and landscapes littered with ripped bodies, I dreamt of my prim New England village. No thoughts, only longing. Only pictures of my long walks down the beach, searching for a hermit crab.
One of the horrible stories that Henry tells is of he's ferrying a wounded French lieutenant back from the front lines. He says they had lost one of the men in his unit in the battle for Fort Douaumont. He went back, he and a couple of his men, to try to find the missing soldier. And when they do, in a deep shell crater, they hear a voice calling out to them in French, but with a German accent. You know, Frenchman, come over here. It turned out to be a German officer with a group of his men who were mortally wounded and were down in this crater. And he was begging the lieutenant to kill them. You know, they were that far gone. At first, the French lieutenant says, no, we're not going to do that. And then he realizes it's the only humane thing to do. So he said he and his men lobbed grenades in there until the cries and the moaning ceased, and then returned back to their lines. So this is the kind of thing that Henry is seeing and hearing about on a constant basis during the battle at Verdun.
While in the trenches, the thoughts of home in New England were comforting. Upon his return home, it was the memories of the war that haunted him, despite his walks along the bucolic shores of Outer Cape Cod.
He also was profoundly affected by the memories of what happened during the war, what he had seen, what he had witnessed. And one of the interesting things is that He doesn't show that so much early on. And I think that was because, both as an ambulance driver and then later as a correspondent, he was so busy that you don't have time to reflect very much about what you're doing. You always have a job to do.
He hated war with a vengeance, and the political world that caused such conflicts. Brutal, destructive, innocent women and children being killed. But as the years went by, and when he thought more and more about what the Industrial Revolution was doing, he became very disillusioned with it, with war being a business, with the citizenry as stockholders. The more he got a little distance from the war, the more it started to haunt him. In 1919, Henry left the war with millions of other veterans. After the war, Henry sought to know and hear as little as he could. In search of a happy ending, Henry began writing books of fairy tales. But it wasn't until Beston's year on the Cape, still several years and several miles away, that the real healing process could begin.